Hey there, welcome to another episode of Digging In. Today we are going to be digging into Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. This is the parable of the persistent widow, it's sometimes called, and it's a story. The story is fairly straightforward and simple. I actually have already laid this text out. I'd actually, I preached on this message a number of years ago, so I already had it laid out from then. So I'm going to pull this up. I'll put it on the screen so that you can follow along, and I'm going to just kind of make some observations about this and kind of give you some guidance in terms of how do we study a text like this. You've heard me say by now that the context is always important. Why does Jesus tell this story? And the simple answer is right here that they should always pray and not give up. Now, I'm going to point out something in a little bit to show that there's actually more to it than this. A lot of times we interpret this parable as simply an invitation to keep on praying, and if we pray enough, then God will eventually answer our prayers and give us what we're asking for. In some ways, that's accurate. In other ways, it's too general, and there's something more specific that Jesus is after. But in any case, this parable is meant as an encouragement to Jesus' disciples. It's meant to encourage them in their prayer life. The story itself is, as I said, it's pretty straightforward. It's a story about a judge who uh, we read that a widow keeps coming to this judge, and we'll highlight this a number of different times. The second occurrence of that word's a little bit later, so maybe we'll leave that for now. We'll take that out. One of the qualities, though, of the judge is what's important. So let's highlight that because this is repeated twice. He's a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. In particular, this word here, um, cared what people thought, is a word that's related to the idea of shame. In New Testament times, especially, the idea of shame was a very powerful force for good or for evil in a community. In other words, shame is not exactly what we might think of today. Shame really has to do with your honoring and keeping the rules and norms of a community, and those who don't do that, those who don't measure up to the traditional standards and expectations that a community holds to, are viewed with shame, which is to say they're viewed. People look down on them because they don't keep the norms of a community. Conversely, honor means that a person really does live up to the ideals of a community, and so they're held in high regard and high esteem. So this judge here, not only does he not fear God, which would have to do with his moral compass. In other words, if you fear God, you adhere to his law. You seek and you strive after righteousness. And if you're a judge, you want to implement righteousness according to God's law. Not only does this judge not have any sort of moral compass in that sense, but he also doesn't have any care or concern for his place in the community. So he's not really concerned about whether or not he's living up to God's law and how that would affect other people and their view of him. So he's really an amoral person, and he cares very little for what that looks like in the eyes of others. I think maybe one of the best examples that I can think of is in I think it was 1954, the Joseph McCarthy hearings, and finally Joseph Welch. After all this has been going on, Joseph Welch finally comes out at Senator McCarthy and says, at long last, have you no decency? That was really an indictment of McCarthy and his willingness to do whatever it took just to make his point, even if that meant dragging the names of innocent people through the mud. That's what it means to have no regard for what people think or no shame. In any case, there's a widow in this town who keeps persisting with this plea, and the plea that she makes is important. She's praying for justice. Justice, as it's spoken here, is a sort of a two-pronged thing. She wants punishment for whoever has done her wrong. Justice, this word includes the concept of it's a penal thing. It has to do with addressing wrongdoers. Now, widows in those days were often a very disadvantaged class of people. They often didn't even have legal standing in a court. And so for them to expect justice was a very tall order and a very unlikely expectation. If you're a widow and if you know that if the community does not really pay much attention to widows and doesn't give them legal standing, then it's pretty easy to take advantage of them. And so in some way, this is a very typical story. A widow has not been given justice. Someone has taken advantage of her or exploited her, or she has been someone has maybe financially taken advantage of her. So she wants whoever has done her wrong to be punished, but she also wants, we might say, well, let's call it this. Let's call it vindication. Um, she wants to be, or maybe it's better to say she wants to be made whole. Oops. To be made whole is to have whatever was lost, whether it be reputation or whether it be some kind of financial loss, you want that restored. So you want the person who has done you wrong to be punished, but you also want your whatever it is that you have lost to be restored. That's really what justice is all about, biblical justice. And this woman, this widow, keeps pleading for that. And the judge, because he cares nothing about God and because he cares nothing about how other people see him and his relationship to the law, he just doesn't act on it. He does very little to do it. So we read that he refuses. Now, I'm going to bring us to the next part of this story. Um, and we read here again, the same idea is repeated that we saw earlier, the quality of the judge. I don't fear God. I don't care what people think. So that clearly we're meant to clearly identify this with the judge. So that quality of the judge is emphasized, but and there's that contrastive word yet, because this widow keeps bothering, I will see that she gets justice. So there's that word. I highlighted it already. I'll highlight it one more time just to draw our attention to it. This is what the woman is after. She's after justice. She wants the wrongdoer punished and she wants to be made whole. Now, the judge in this case does not commit to doing it because he fears God or because he cares about doing the right thing in the eyes of the community. He's really more pragmatic about it. He's worried that she's eventually going to come and attack. Now, that's kind of a strange phrase that suggests that maybe he's afraid that somehow the woman is going to, all this pent-up anger and frustration is going to come out in a way of violence. The word there is actually somewhat ambiguous. It could also mean that he's just worried that she's going to drive him nuts and she's going to just completely wear him down and his patience is going to be gone. That's another very distinct possibility in this in the interpretation of this. And so as a result of that, or out of a concern for that, the woman or the judge decides to do what is right. So he's not, again, it's not that his heart has changed. It's not that he's passionate about what God is passionate about. He's really still self acting out of self-preservation, and he's not going to do anything to he's not going to he doesn't want to be worn down. Now, this is where then Jesus begins to interpret the story for us, and we gain some insight into what Jesus is really after. Will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day or night? Now, that can be a little bit, in some ways, it can be a little bit confusing to compare God to a judge who is indifferent and amoral. But you have to understand that what Jesus is doing is he's using an argument from less to greater. So, in other words, if even a corrupt judge will finally come around and do what is right, the thinking is how much more then? So if a corrupt and amoral judge will act this way, how much more will a righteous and good and just God do what is right? In other words, if even evil people know on some level to do what is pragmatic, even if for the wrong reasons, if we know that God is greater than that, then his actions are more certain and we can even trust them even more. That's what Jesus is saying. Now, the application here is what is really important. So here's the first part of application. It's crying out, and I'll highlight it here in yellow. What does God want us to do? He wants us to cry out to him day and night. In other words, he wants us to be persistent in prayer, and he wants us to be persistent because there's a promise here for us, and that is that he will not keep putting us off. God is responsive to our prayers, and he answers our prayers, and he assures us that they will get justice and quickly. God is going to do justice for his people. Now, that brings me to the final sentence of this whole parable, and in some ways, it's maybe the most important sentence. Oops, I need to do. um, it's um, it's this last little clause, this last little phrase here, because what Jesus is asking is not just will we be people of prayer, but it's actually when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Now, why does that matter? Because the context here of this parable is important. We didn't look at it in this study here, but at the beginning of chapter 18, it begins by saying, Then Jesus told his disciples, and the then is sort of a consecutive word. It says, this follows after that. And the that we haven't looked at is all of chapter 17. Now, that's not rocket science. What comes before chapter 18? Chapter 17. What is chapter 17 about? Well, the last part of chapter 17, Jesus is focused on on his return, and he's talking about what is life going to be like in the world as the world waits for the return of Jesus. And he describes in great detail the immorality and the corruption and the violence that are going to be so prevalent on earth. And he's warning his disciples. He's really saying that things are going to get very, very difficult, just like it was for the people in the time of Noah, just like it was for the people in the time of Sodom and Gomorrah. There's going to be this widespread corruption and evil, and it's going to be difficult for Christians. And so it's in that context then that Jesus says, we need to be faithful in prayer. We need to be praying in these times. Why does that matter? Because we get disheartened, we get discouraged. I don't know about you, but you look around at the world and the way things are, and sometimes it's easy to just slide into sort of despair about the state of affairs in our world today. We get discouraged about how we sometimes see evil triumphing. We get discouraged about the polarization in our culture. We get discouraged about the way that in parts of the world Christians are marginalized and martyred and killed for their faith. And so, yeah, you lose heart over that. But what Jesus is saying is, no, don't lose heart over that, but pray. Now, specifically, what Jesus is encouraging us to pray for is not just whatever our hearts desire, but to pray for justice, to pray that the wrong will be made right again when Jesus returns. And the question that he leaves us with is not so much, are you going to keep praying? Although that's part of what this is saying is, will he find faith on earth? Do we trust Jesus to be the one who will come and restore all that has been broken and all that has gone wrong? The encouragement for you and for me is to not lose heart, even when the world seems to be a place of disillusionment and discouragement, but rather to pray for that day when justice will come and to know that God is even better than an unjust judge and he will establish righteousness in the end. I hope you'll join me. We're going to be looking at this on July 29th, and I hope you'll join in for that message. And I look forward to studying it even more with you. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Digging In. See you next time.